In 1960, South Korea was poorer than Haiti. Today, its companies build your phone, your car, and a significant portion of the goods inside your home. So, how does a nation with virtually no resources, no capital, and seemingly no hope transform into one of the wealthiest on Earth in just a few short decades? To understand, we have to go back to 1953. The Korean War had just concluded, leaving South Korea in absolute ruins. The devastation was total. Its economy was shattered, its infrastructure had vanished, and its people were starving. The average income was less than $100 per person annually, placing it on par with the most impoverished nations in Africa. At the time, countries like Ghana and Pakistan were wealthier. Even North Korea, its northern rival, enjoyed a higher standard of living. In the aftermath of the war, people were forced to eat tree bark just to survive. Each spring, when the previous year's harvest ran out, families would scour the hillsides for anything edible: grass, herbs, roots, whatever they could find. American soldiers stationed there would hand out candy and gum to curious Korean children who had never tasted such things before. These simple treats were a source of amazement, a glimpse into a world of abundance they couldn't comprehend. The country had almost nothing to build on. Roughly 80% of the urban population lived below the poverty line, and only 22% of the people could read and write. There were no natural resources to speak of, no oil, and barely any coal. The landscape was predominantly mountainous, with only about 22% of the land suitable for farming. To make matters worse, the industrial and resource-rich territories were all in the north, leaving the south with little more than agriculture and poverty. South Korea was utterly dependent on foreign aid for its very survival. American assistance was the lifeline keeping the country afloat. At one point in the 1950s, foreign aid accounted for nearly 80% of the government's entire budget. Without that constant influx of money, the state would have collapsed. International observers looked at the situation and essentially wrote the country off as a lost cause. Then, in 1961, an event occurred that would forever alter South Korea's destiny. A military general named Park Chung-hee seized power in a coup. Now, before we go any further, it's crucial to be clear about one thing. Park was an authoritarian leader. He ruled the country like a dictator, particularly after 1972, suppressing free speech, crushing political opposition, and committing widespread human rights violations. Dissent was not tolerated. Those who spoke out against the government were arrested. The media was state-controlled. By any measure, it was not a free society. Yet, Park also became the architect of South Korea's economic miracle. At the time of the coup, most South Koreans supported the takeover. They were desperate. The previous government had been weak, corrupt, and utterly ineffective. More than a decade after the war, the economy was stagnant, and people were still poor and hungry. They yearned for a leader who could deliver results, even if that person was harsh and undemocratic. Park came to power with a single, laser-focused objective: economic development. He staked his entire political legitimacy on making South Korea rich and was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. He immediately established new government agencies to oversee economic planning, with the Economic Planning Board serving as the command center for the nation's development strategy. These were not just paper-pushing bureaucrats. Park recruited a team of highly educated technocrats, many of whom had studied modern economics in the United States. He empowered them to design and execute a radical transformation of the economy. At the same time, Park founded the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, to monitor the population and maintain his iron grip on power, and he created the Democratic Republican Party to dominate the political system. It was a fusion of authoritarian control and centralized economic planning. In the early 1960s, South Korea faced a monumental problem. To grow, the country needed to import nearly everything: machinery, technology, and fuel. But to pay for imports, you need foreign currency, which you can only earn by exporting goods that other countries want to buy. The problem was, South Korea had nothing of value to export. So, the government made a decision that seemed insane at the time. It decided to channel all of the nation's energy into exports, not making products for Koreans, but for the rest of the world. This represented a dramatic pivot from the previous strategy of import substitution, which involved trying to produce everything domestically. That approach had failed, resulting in low-quality goods while the country remained dependent on foreign imports. Park's new mantra was simple: export or die. In 1962, South Korea's total exports were worth a mere $55 million. By the 1990s, that figure had skyrocketed to over $100 billion. Exports surged from less than 1% of the economy to over 30% in just 2 decades. But how do you export when you have nothing to sell? South Korea started with the absolute basics. Its first major export was wigs. That's right, human hair wigs. This unlikely product became the country's initial entry into the global market. Korean women would sell their hair, which was then manufactured into wigs and exported to the United States and Europe. It may sound absurd, but it worked, bringing in desperately needed foreign currency. From there, the nation moved into textiles and garments. South Korea's one major advantage was a large supply of cheap labor. Factories began churning out clothes, shoes, and fabrics for foreign markets. The conditions were brutal. Korean workers endured 10 to 12-hour days in factories, often attending night school afterward to learn how to read and write. The pay was meager, but this grueling work laid the foundation for everything that followed. The government was not a passive observer. It was an aggressive promoter of this export-driven model. Companies that exported received preferential treatment, including low-interest loans, tax breaks, and access to foreign currency. The state rewarded success and punished failure. If a company hit its export targets, it received more support. If it underperformed, it was cut off. This approach was ruthless, but incredibly effective. This brings us to the Chaebols. These are the massive, family-controlled business empires that dominate South Korea to this day. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK Group. They are not just large companies. They are sprawling conglomerates involved in nearly every sector of the economy. Samsung doesn't just make phones. It builds ships, constructs skyscrapers, runs insurance companies, and owns amusement parks. Hyundai is known for its cars, but it also has major divisions in shipbuilding, construction, and hospitality. The word Chaebol itself combines the Korean characters for wealth and clan, which perfectly describes their nature as powerful, family-run dynasties. The same families who founded these companies in the 1950s and 60s still control them today. Park Chung-hee did not create the Chaebols, but he nurtured them into the giants they are now. He believed that South Korea needed large-scale corporations with the resources to compete on the world stage. So he handpicked promising businesses and showered them with government support, low-interest loans, protection from foreign competition, and privileged access to imported materials. The government's message was clear: we are betting on you. Now go conquer the world. And they did. The Chaebols grew into economic behemoths. Today, the top 4, Samsung, SK, Hyundai, and LG, account for over 40% of South Korea's entire economy. Samsung alone represents about 20% of the country's GDP. To put that in perspective, a massive American company like Apple or Amazon makes up only 2 to 3% of the U.S. GDP. The concentration of economic power in South Korea is almost unparalleled. These companies became hyper-efficient export machines. They started with simple manufacturing like textiles and electronics assembly, then progressively moved into more complex industries: steel, shipbuilding, chemicals, and automobiles. By the 1980s and 90s, they were producing semiconductors, display panels, and other high-tech electronics that could compete with the best in the world. The Chaebols were far from perfect. They were plagued by corruption and wielded excessive political influence. Their founding families often operated above the law, escaping serious punishment because they were deemed too important to the economy. Leaders of Samsung, Hyundai, and other Chaebols have been convicted of bribery, embezzlement, and tax evasion, yet many served little to no jail time or were granted presidential pardons. But for all their flaws, the Chaebols delivered. They transformed South Korea into an export powerhouse, created millions of jobs, and turned a nation that once sold wigs into a global leader in advanced technology. However, there's a crucial element that is often overlooked in this story: education. South Korea invested in its people on a scale that few other nations have. This was not just about building factories. It was about building human capital. Immediately after the war, the government made education a top national priority, launching a massive campaign to eradicate illiteracy. The goal was to teach every adult to read and write, at least to a second-grade level. The commitment was extraordinary. During the war, parents sold livestock and land just to keep schools open. Afterward, classes were held wherever space could be found, in abandoned factories, tents, or bombed-out buildings. With a shortage of teachers, class sizes swelled to 100 students or more, sometimes running in multiple shifts from dawn until dusk. And it worked. Between 1945 and 1960, primary school enrollment tripled, secondary school enrollment grew eightfold, and higher education enrollment increased tenfold. By 1960, nearly every child in South Korea was attending primary school, and the dropout rate was one of the lowest in the developing world. By 1970, the nation's literacy rate had soared to 87. This focus extended beyond basic literacy. The government invested heavily in vocational schools and universities to produce the engineers, scientists, and skilled technicians the country needed. Thousands of Koreans were sent abroad to study, primarily in the U.S., and then returned to apply their knowledge in government or private industry. These individuals became the backbone of South Korea's development. Education became the great social equalizer. In a society with a traditionally rigid class system, it offered a pathway for social and economic mobility. Tapping into a deep-seated Confucian reverence for learning, the government supercharged this cultural value. It was common for factory workers to endure grueling 10 to 12-hour shifts and then attend night classes to upgrade their skills. Students competed fiercely for spots at top universities, knowing that a good education was their ticket to a better life. To this day, South Korean students are renowned for their intense dedication to their studies. The government understood a fundamental truth. You cannot build a modern economy without an educated workforce. You can't operate complex machinery, innovate new technologies, or compete with advanced nations. So, they invested as much in people as they did in factories and infrastructure. This created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. Better education led to a more skilled workforce, which attracted more investment, which created more jobs and tax revenue, which was then reinvested back into education. South Korea's success was not left to chance or the free market. The government had a plan, or rather, a series of them. Starting in 1962, Park's administration launched a sequence of 5-year economic development plans. These were detailed roadmaps with specific targets for growth, exports, and industrial development. The first plan focused on building foundational infrastructure and light manufacturing, roads, power plants, and factories for textiles and consumer goods. The second and third plans, spanning the 1970s, pivoted to heavy industry. This was the heavy and chemical industry drive, which targeted sectors like steel, chemicals, shipbuilding, and machinery. The government poured resources into these strategic industries, creating special industrial zones with dedicated infrastructure. This strategy was heavily influenced by Japan's post-war development model, which utilized government guidance and large industrial groups, *Kiretsu*, to rebuild its economy. Park effectively created a Korean version of that playbook. But the government didn't just plan, it rigorously executed. If a company failed to meet its targets, its support was withdrawn. If a village in a rural development program underperformed, its resources were reallocated to a more successful one. This philosophy of feeding success was harsh, but it ensured that capital and support flowed to the most productive parts of the economy. The results were astonishing. For nearly 3 decades, GDP growth averaged between 7% and 10% per year. To put that in context, most developed countries are content with 2 to 3% growth. South Korea was consistently tripling or quadrupling that rate, year after year. This rapid development was marked by a steady climb up the value chain. In the 1960s, it was wigs, textiles, and shoes, basic, labor-intensive goods. By the 1970s, South Korea was producing steel. The creation of the Pohang Iron and Steel Company, now POSCO, was a monumental achievement, as steel is the backbone of industrialization. With government backing, the country built a world-class steel industry from scratch. Shipbuilding also took off, with Hyundai Heavy Industries becoming one of the largest shipbuilders in the world. A nation with virtually no prior capacity was soon constructing some of the most advanced vessels on the planet. The auto industry began with the Hyundai Pony in 1975. It was a basic car, but it was a start. Over decades of relentless improvement, Hyundai and Kia became major global brands. Samsung, which started as a trading company in 1938, moved into textiles and then consumer electronics. By the 1990s, it was a dominant force in semiconductors and display panels, and today it is the world's largest manufacturer of memory chips and smartphones. LG and SK Group followed similar trajectories, evolving into giants of technology and telecommunications. This progression from labor-intensive to capital-intensive and finally to technology-intensive industries was a deliberate reflection of the country's growing capabilities. As its workforce became more educated and capital accumulated, South Korea was able to master ever more complex products. By the 2000s, it had completed its transformation. South Korea joined the OECD, the Club of Rich Nations, and became a donor country, providing aid to developing nations rather than receiving it. In 1997, the nation faced its greatest test, the Asian financial crisis. The crisis hit the region like a tsunami, causing currencies to collapse and companies to go bankrupt. South Korea was hit hard. Its currency, the won, lost half its value almost overnight, forcing the country to seek a humiliating bailout from the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The crisis exposed deep-seated problems in the Korean model. The Chaebols were over-leveraged, the banks were burdened with bad loans, and the ties between government and big business were too close. But South Korea responded with remarkable speed and resilience. It implemented tough reforms, restructured its banks, and allowed failing companies to collapse. Corporate governance was improved, and labor markets were made more flexible. By the early 2000s, the economy was back on track, now more balanced and resilient. The crisis, in a painful way, forced changes that ultimately made the country stronger. Today, South Korea is the world's 12th largest economy. It is a high-income nation at the forefront of global technology. Its companies are leaders in semiconductors, smartphones, cars, and shipbuilding. Moreover, its culture, K-pop, films, and television dramas, has become a global phenomenon and a major export in its own right. The miracle on the Han River was not a miracle at all. It was the result of a meticulously executed plan, carried out with relentless discipline and determination by millions of people who refused to accept their circumstances. They built a global powerhouse from the ashes of war, and in doing so, they remade their future and changed the course of history. Subscribe to keep watching Audio Point. Thanks for watching.